G'day. Welcome to the Agricoach podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. Welcome back to the Agricoach Wealth and Wisdom podcast. I'm your host, Ben Law, and today we're discussing a crucial topic for farming families. How do you ensure a smooth transfer of assets from one generation to the next? Whether it's land, livestock, or equipment, the process of passing these valuable assets to the next generation can be complex and full of potential challenges. One tool that can help make this process much clearer and less stressful is a family agreement. It's a way to set expectations, outline responsibilities, and make sure that everyone in the family knows where they stand when it comes to the future of the farm. Today, I'm joined again by Kylie Wilson from Spark Helmore. Kylie's been on the podcast a number of times, and her last episode, number 36, talking about partnerships, family trusts, and companies, was extremely popular, as are all the technical type episodes we do. I'm guessing the reason for that is people just want to learn and understand things better. Kylie's a lawyer, an expert in family agreements, and all things related to rural asset planning. Kylie's going to walk us through how these agreements work, why they're so important for farming families, and how they can help avoid common pitfalls when it comes to asset transfers. We'll also explore a real-life case study to give you an idea of how a family agreement can make a real difference in maintaining family harmony while protecting your family's financial future. So if you're a family on the land and you're looking to ensure a smooth transfer of assets to the next generation and protect your overall family's future, this will be the episode for you. Now, anytime we do an episode that might have a technical component where there's a professional advisor, we have to give a disclaimer to keep the lawyers happy. So before we kick off, the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for education purposes only. It's not financial advice. It's not legal advice. It's not accounting advice. It's not tax advice. No one should act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor and I choose to no longer be licensed, and I cannot and will not give you specific or personal advice in this podcast. So now that we've got the lawyers happy, welcome back to the show, Kylie.
Thanks for having me back, Ben. Always good to have a chat about these things.
Yeah, well, these are the technical discussions that I love having, and it's actually really surprising. Quite often the technical ones are the most popular out on the podcast. So I'd encourage anyone that's listening and it gets a little bit heavy to actually just bear with us for a little while, because there's great value to be got out of this.
And we'll try and simplify it as much as possible.
Yeah, we will. Yeah. So Kylie, where I want to kick this off is we're talking about transitioning wealth from one generation to the other, and in an agribusiness type scenario. So that's transitioning the agribusiness, the land assets, and then also in quite often non-farming assets to non-farming children. Yeah. And back when I was a financial advisor, there was essentially 3 stages I used to go through, Kylie, in giving advice to families. And there was the preparation, number 1, number 2 was planning, and number 3 was implementation. Now, when it comes to families, when it comes to transitioning assets in the succession space, there's 3 areas, I think, or 3 stages we need to go through, and that's the preparation, planning, and then implementation. Now, preparation is preparing the current generation. So we've got to prepare them. We've got to work out what the bloody hell do they want out of their life, mum and dad? When do they want to retire? What does retirement want to look like? How do we get in a financial position where we can do that?
What's retirement going to cost? Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Then we need to start preparing the business. So we prepare the business to be able to transition leadership and control. Then we've got to prepare the next generation. And that's both the on-farm siblings and the non-farming siblings. And that also includes not just being a farmer or a good custodian of wealth. It's also the soft skills around communication, negotiation, etc. So that's the first stage. The next stage is planning. And that's how do we actually transition these assets? Or how do we transition responsibility, mum and dad into retirement, leadership in the business, and then get those assets over. And then the last stage is implementation. How do we actually get this shit done and get it right? And when we get stuck, how do we get unstuck again? Now, through those 3 phases, there's lots of potential points for failure. And that's why succession is really simple, but it's not easy. No. Now, the one we're going to tackle today, Kylie, and I'm just about to hand over to yourself, is is we get stuck between the planning and the implementation phase.
Yeah.
And that's essentially working out what the bloody hell we're going to do.
And the wheels can come off very quickly.
Yeah, mutually understanding what that is and then getting an agreement in place and then sticking to it.
Yeah.
Now, one of those things we can have is called a family agreement. So I want to kick over to you and ask you first up, what the bloody hell is a family agreement and how does it actually work?
Well, it is essentially what it sounds like, surprisingly enough, because usually these things aren't simple. But it is an agreement between the family about exactly what the transition is. Now, ideally, you like to have all family members agreeing, but it also you need to think about things like if you're transitioning high value assets and a farming business to the next generation, and let's say what is commonly the case, as you know, Ben, is there might be only one child on farm and a number of children off farm. What happens when things actually go wrong with the implementation and after the implementation? So family agreements are designed to make sure of a couple of things. One is that everyone actually understands what the agreement is, that everyone accepts what the implementation of the plan is so that it minimises the prospect of miscommunication and disputes later.
Yeah. Technical dust-ups.
That's it. But also then, what if something with the plan then goes wrong? Because, for example, if a child is killed in a car accident a couple of years down the track, those type of things are all part of the process but need to be documented and sometimes need to be secured. So family agreements are designed essentially to cover what will happen and how it's going to happen, the purpose being so that everyone doesn't end up in court arguing about it if it's avoidable.
So it's a legally binding document, is that right?
It is. It's essentially a contract. And the other thing people need to understand about these is just because it's a contract, so it's enforceable. So if you haven't reached the point where you can have an enforceable contract, that might not be what's ideal for you in the shorter term. It also can be changed if everyone agrees. So as you and I have discussed many times over the years, sometimes in these succession situations, things don't always go to plan or something needs to be changed. It certainly can be, as long as all the parties to the family agreement agree.
So they're not locked in, as in like when you buy a house, this is the contract, you've got to fulfill that contract. We can get back in and vary it. It just stops us getting to a point where we disagree and then not being able to come to an agreement without going to court.
Yeah. It also helps, I think, sometimes when you're working on the agreement, to identify areas that might not have been discussed or planned for properly that might be important. So, and keeping in mind, because these things are contracts, you also have to be very conscious when you're documenting these things that you are not unintentionally causing problems with duty or capital gains tax, depending on what's in the agreements. Also, what are the structures within the family? So, is the business run in a trust? Is the business run in a company? Does that entity need to be a party to the agreement because it's affected as part of the transition process? So the details to have a proper family agreement that works well for the family and allows for things to be covered and change is actually important. And there's a fair bit of detail in it. And there's no such thing as a template, in my view, for these things, because they need to fit the family's circumstances and they need to fit the assets and the structures that are in place. And if they don't cover all of those things, something might get missed, so you don't actually have the document in place that's designed to do what it's designed to do, which is to prevent miscommunication and dispute down the track.
So what does one look like, Kylie? Like, what is it actually addressing, just to give people an idea of, how this might work? Because with a will, you can see it. It says, if I die, I leave, mum's jewelry to Mary and I leave the farm to Johnny and whatever it might be.
Well, and interestingly, sometimes they often address the will because that might be annexed to the agreement as part of the agreement about what the children off farm are going to do. Not always, but sometimes. So essentially what they're predominantly addressing is what is transferring to the next generation, how and when is that transferring, who's covering any transactional costs. Because as you and I both know, if parents are retiring, it's very important that they're financially secure in retirement. And if they're going to suddenly get a CGT bill 12 months later, that might undermine what they thought was their retirement capital. So that should be being addressed in the process. Who's actually covering the capital gains tax assessment, if there is one? Hopefully there's not, because it's great when we don't have that and they can get the 15-year exemption and things like that. Aged care is often missed in these family agreements, but let's say we have a situation where mum and dad thought they had enough retirement capital, but it might have only just been enough retirement capital because for the business to be viable for the next generation, there might have been a struggle to get more. And they have some medical issues, and those medical issues eat into their retirement capital, and there's an issue then with paying the bond in aged care. And we've talked about this before, but one of the biggest areas I see of disputes after the event between siblings is where siblings off farm are having to help fund mum and dad's aged care, and sibling on farm is saying, I can't afford to do so. So the family agreement should actually document what happens if things don't go to plan. Who's actually doing what? Aged care is an important one in that context. But then also, if something happens to child on farm, should there be a mortgage back to the family? So a second mortgage. So let's say, and this has happened in my experience, if child on farm passes away and spouse decides to sell everything, mortgage should secure what might come back to the family within 5 or 10 years. I tend to say preferably never longer than 10, because by that point in time, you've got that much sweat equity in the place to that next generation that it's their family's asset at that point. But those type of things, and these should all be things that have been communicated and discussed as part of the plan before hitting the implementation stage. However, sometimes actually getting to documenting the agreement and pull out some things in the plan that actually need to be discussed and finalised. That might not have been at that point.
Yeah, and that's a really good important point, Kylie, because I see a lot of families get themselves into god-awful strife because they're a relatively close family. You know, they get on pretty well, relationships are good, and they say, you know, Ben, we don't want to upset the apple cart. We don't want to have these discussions. And then what happens is, you know, they don't have the discussions, everyone smiles and nods, and all of a sudden something like this happens, like you mentioned, the aged care issue, and then the whole family blows up because nobody's had those tough discussions earlier on. So
and it's usually in a grief moment too. So it's grief, divorce, financial disaster. It's a whole psychological issue because people are acting on emotion, so they can't react with commercial logic. You can't expect them to generally because they're grieving in some way. The plan where people have documented things and there's an agreement in place helps overcome those emotional decisions. And when I say this, I am not doing good business for myself because lawyers generally, litigation costs a lot more money. But what we're trying to prevent here is exactly that, because the only people who win in court are the law firms who are running the actions. So the idea is to actually make sure we don't in any way, shape or form want to create the argument in the course of doing the agreement. So it's important that that communication has happened, and if it can't happen or there's some sort of impediment to it happening, then the family needs to get a good facilitator in to work through it with them.
It's better to have the, shall we say, the hard discussions when the family's got robust and strong relationships than wait till it deteriorates. And as you said, then emotions kick in and you know, then the lawyers get rich.
Much easier to deal with. It's the nature of being human. Resentments fester and stew. So by the time they've kind of stewed, it's much harder to have the communication. So the earlier you get your education on communication and how to do that or identify that there might be a problem, the much, much easier to solve.
Well, also memories change. You know, if you've had a discussion over 5 or 10 years about succession and then people start to build up in their mind of what they thought would happen and what mum and dad thought would happen, what the off-farm siblings thought would happen, and then all of a sudden you get people make their own. You know, it can be innocent, but also they can make stories up in their head of what they thought would happen.
They can completely believe it. That's the problem. And they can completely believe it and be 100% prepared to put it in an affidavit.
Or they think it's fair. They go, well, I thought that's fair, so that's what will happen. And then when this whole perceived fairness comes in, then we start to get into awful strife.
Yeah. And that's an important point too, Ben, in that getting to the agreement point, particularly with farming families, because I had a conversation with one the other day where the discussion was around, well, we need to do what's fair if something happens to him in the next 5 years. And the view of fair was if it's sold, it's all comes back to us, essentially. And I said, well, let's just think about that for a moment, because if that child is staying on the farm, as you've said before, they are a custodian. If it's worth $20 million, that doesn't mean they will ever have $20 million. You've got to actually look at the cash flow. So what are they living off, as opposed to looking at these dollar signs? Because as you and I both know, fare is rarely equal when it comes to farming families in particular.
The big fears I see in the current generation, Kylie, when going through this whole process of transferring assets is, well, in many cases, what happens is we will transition the farm to the next generation because of the value for substantially less than it's worth.
Yeah.
So in other words, the farm's worth $50 million. We'll transition it to them for $2 or $3 million. That's enough to retire. That doesn't give them an overburden of debt because they've already got debt. That's their viable. We can retire or off we go. Then what happens is they're fearful that 2 or 3 things might happen. Is one is death. They die and next thing the farm gets sold. Number 2 is divorce. So all of a sudden a divorce comes through. Or number 3 is they just wake up one day and go, well, the farm's worth $50 million. We've got this from mum and dad. Yoo-hoo, let's sell it and go live the good life.
Never have to work another day in my life.
Yeah. So whether this is a reality in a family or a fear, I think we have to be fair enough to the older generation and say this is a legitimate fear. Now, it may never happen. Is this a way of protecting?
It's why the family agreements are so important.
Yeah, and so this will mitigate these risks.
Yeah, because if you just go holus bolus, which I see all the time, I am transferring everything over. We've had the discussions, everyone's happy, and something goes wrong and you don't have the agreement in place, it is very hard to recover from that. So it is very hard to say to child's spouse, you need to give half of that back to the family. Generally, the answer will be no. It might not be, it might be absolutely sure, yes. But again, at that point, you're dealing with people who are grieving, and emotive reactions in my, sadly, many years of doing this are rarely commercially logical reactions. So the point with the family agreement is we can do them so easily when what you're saying as far as the process is concerned has actually happened. So where they have gone through the education process, the planning process, the parents have got financial advice on what it is they need to retire on. If there's a communication issue, they've had a facilitator. They've worked through exactly what it is they want to do, and we're just documenting it. But where something goes wrong or they're concerned about risks, those risks can be catered for in the agreement. There will be certain terms in the agreement, and so what we call default events. So if there are certain things they're concerned about which would trigger a default under the agreement, a mortgage might be enforceable. And that would make sure that if the property is going to be sold, a certain amount has to come back to the family.
Or they might have first right to buy that equity stake off.
First right of refusal or any of those sort of things, as long as they've talked through it. But those things are certainly documentable in a family agreement. What I do say to clients is ideally they should have security. So ideally, if you are documenting these things that might happen afterwards, you should have a mortgage. Often it's a second mortgage, but you should have a mortgage in place to secure it. Or you should think about PPSR if you need to look at company shares and things like that. So the Personal Property Security Register to secure things. But those type of things are certainly worth a discussion around. As I say, don't bind people up in knots forever, but certainly for a period of time, if everything went wrong, what do we need to cover?
You've worked bloody hard to build a profitable, scalable and well-run operation. But now, as your children are finishing their education and starting to take an interest in the family business, you're realising it's time to shift focus. It's no longer just about farm prosperity. It's now about family prosperity. You need to align your family, start preparing the next generation, improve communication and strengthen family relationships. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. And that's why we created the High Performing Families Workshop to guide families through this crucial transition. Want to know more? Head over to www.agricoach.com.au/take action. Now, let's head back to the episode.
And it's interesting, Kylie, I think it will cause friction in the family, having these discussions, without a doubt. Like, let's not sugarcoat it. Being able to come to an agreement is going to require a little bit of, from mild discomfort about things they don't want to talk about, like divorce or death, etc., to absolutely full-blown arguments about things. But the reality is it's either have them now, get them over, get them done, strengthen the relationships.
Work through it. It's much healthier to work through it. I mean, because I'll often see parents will feel guilty about thinking that they should have more if things go wrong. Children will often be concerned about, do they actually have enough in retirement? But, my accountant's telling me if I give any more, there's no way this business is viable. And that's important. There is no point setting children up to fail. The business has to be able to continue and move forward, or otherwise there's...
Because that's the thing is you can have those discussions now, but if it does go pear-shaped, which in a lot of families it does when something goes wrong, that's the reality. Even the families with the strongest relationships, it's going to cost you far more financially to go to court and fight this out, let alone the things that money can't buy, not being able to, sit around the kitchen table together. And I still remember that example we ran into about 7 or 8 years ago, Kylie, and a family that got into a dust-up, and I think the legal bills came to almost $2 million over a son and daughter-in-law and father who had an agreement. And then from memory, I think it was the father reneged on the agreement after 20 years and then all of a sudden decided, no, you're not going to get the farm. I'm going to share it equally between everyone, and caused this huge dust up that could have been simply resolved with in hindsight, a very, very cheap document.
That's right. Had it been in place, then father saying, I'm just going to split it between everyone would have been a breach of the agreement. And the difference is that's not to say there's not a dispute in enforcing the contract, but it is a much simpler action. You have the document there, you know the terms. Has this term been breached? It is simpler for the court to determine that. Anything where we're talking about proprietary estoppel, where, dad's promised son something and then hasn't delivered it.
I thought.
Yep. They're called equitable actions. So it's a jurisdiction in equity. It's almost always the Supreme Court, which is more expensive. And we are talking, as you said before, often because they haven't documented it, people's memories. And that becomes the judge has to determine from them being cross-examined, usually on the stand, who's the most reliable witness.
And their perception of fair.
No, and that's not, A, it's not ideal for the family, but B, they rarely talk to each other ever again afterwards because it is a difficult, emotional, costly process. And the purpose, as I say, of these agreements is let's not go there if we can avoid it, because it's also a deterrent. If you've signed an agreement, the family's signed an agreement, to be clear, in Queensland, these agreements, because I've seen people try, they won't prevent a family provision application if someone wants to challenge the estate.
If someone challenges the estate, just to be clear. Yep.
The only way to really properly prevent from that with businesses is to treat your business as a business and do your business succession planning during lifetime. So most of these agreements we're trying to do that so that your major assets aren't exposed. What it does do, though, is make costs prohibitive in trying to run actions because there is agreement that everyone said this is what was agreed. So the person trying to say something different is far more likely to end up with a cost order against them. So it's a good deterrent as well.
Yeah, and just while we're there, it's probably a really important point to restate again that people should get advice from appropriately qualified people to be able to go, how does this work? Because it is complicated, like you said, when there's companies and trusts and on-farm assets and off-farm assets in different entities and different age groups and children with disabilities and drug addictions and things like that. Yep. So it's important you get really quality advice from the right people in your state.
100%, and so important. You mentioned disabilities. So we've had one recently where the child that was disabled didn't get provided for at all on the basis that everyone else would look after them, which is great, but the public trustee's involved and is running a claim. A special disability trust done properly for that child, either during lifetime or in the will, would have catered for that issue. But thinking about those things in particular, the idea of these, as I say, these agreements is where we often see things going wrong that lead to dispute is a failure to communicate properly, people's memories remembering different things and entrenched issues over time. The purpose of these agreements is to overcome all of that And often in trying to get to the agreement that deals with everything appropriately, that will help you overcome some of these issues because you will need to communicate about it.
Yeah, well, there's 2 points there, Kylie. If you think it, you should ink it. So in other
Yeah.
words, if you start having those discussions and you're thinking through things, write it down, because if it's not written down, there's areas that you can...
There's a reason we lawyers get so wound up about documents.
Yeah. So if you think it, ink it is really, really important. And a stitch in time saves 9, get in there, have the discussions up front. Now, Kylie, what I want to go is just quickly is duck into, if someone wanted to do one of these documents, the last thing you want to do is walk into a lawyer's office, sit down and go, here's our family. Can you do up a family agreement? Like, there's a whole lot of work you've got to do to come up with the agreement. Can you just talk me through really quickly, what's the process a family should go so that when they hit the lawyer's office, they're ready to go to keep costs under control and make sure they've got a greater chance of this happening rather than just...
Well, and happening quickly where possible. Probably the really, really big one, which comes up all the time and is often has not been done, is what does everyone actually want? Because if I've got... Dad wants to stay on the farm and die with his boots on, and Mum wants to move to the Sunshine Coast, we've already got a problem we have to deal with first before we can get to agreement stage. Knowing what everyone, as you talked about, that planning point, the communicating point, my view has always been you should know individually what it is you want over the next 5 or 10 years. You should then know what you want if you're in a couple, what you want as a couple over the next 5 or 10 years. And then you should know what the whole family wants as you're working through that process, because it is very hard to get a documented agreement. I had a completely pro bono discussion with a client in Victoria a few months ago. It was really clear to me the reason they couldn't come to an agreement was because this particular son had no idea what he actually wanted. He was unhappy and he had resentments. But when I said, okay, I understand why you're unhappy. I can see why you'd have issues here. I can see why you feel the way you feel. What's the outcome you actually want? You couldn't tell me. So you can't reach agreement and document an agreement if it hasn't been determined what everyone's trying to achieve.
Couldn't agree more, Kylie. I mean, I see it all the time. One of the things that really is one of my bugbears is the fact that I'll have families come and approach me and they'll be ready for succession. And what frustrates the hell out of me is they'll say, look, I popped my head up about 10 years ago and I went to numerous people and said, look, I want to start this whole process. I want to start planning for it. I want to start preparing myself. I want to start preparing the next generation. So this just becomes a smooth process. And everyone tells them, oh, it's a bit early, don't you think, mate? It's another 10 to 15 years away. And for me,
no such thing.
I'm a total advocate, like swim upstream, like go back and start early, because if you start early, it makes the process so much simpler. And if you're having discussions as a family about what does the future look like, where are potential stress points, educating everyone on how to build those soft skills, how to communicate, deal with, resolve.
Well, you create the habits. That's the thing. You create good habits and you create good communication habits. Because I rabbit on about it all the time and too much, but that's because the reality is almost always in families where we see disputes, at some point there's been complete breakdown of communication. Whereas we are creating the education, the understanding, the business. So great example of that is where we talked about custodians. If you've got someone on farm and they're finally getting the business transitioned and they're in their mid-50s or 60 and they've already also got kids on farm, they're never going to have that value. So has there been a discussion around what children off farm are receiving, which might be less, but it's liquid? So that education on this is a business that the view is, if it is the view, is going to keep continuing in the family, and then having all that education, having the kids who are in the business really understand the business. I think that level of education on the financial side of it should be earlier rather than later, because they need to understand that any farming enterprise is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're doing well at 2% return. So if you are making that choice and children are coming on farm and staying on farm, they need to understand what they're the business risks they're taking and what they have to put into it before they've actually sacrificed any other options to get to that point.
And also, too, the earlier you start with your kids, so if you start having these conversations when the kids are 18, 19, 20, 22, 23, and you start have conversations about, well, you need to understand this is a custodial ownership of the farm, what's involved, what do you expect, then when serious discussions start to have to happen, the rubber starts to hit the road to make agreements, everyone's well-versed in these conversations, and it's not like all of a sudden someone pops up and goes, I've never heard this before. I thought, I'm living in Melbourne as a lawyer that has nothing to do with the farm and I expect to get a third of it right now. Now, that might be
I worked on it in my school holidays and therefore I'm entitled to a third of it.
Yeah. Now the family might decide that's what they want. That's fine. That's their choice. But then you head a lot of those things off. And so there's two pieces of advice I give people is, number one, Kylie, is mum and dad, this requires leadership. So mum and dad are going to have to lead the family through this, and they should work out what the bloody hell they want. They should have the conversations and they should lead the family through. If you're in a family and the younger generation, we've got young men, young women out there that are driven and smart. If mum and dad aren't doing that, if they're failing on that behalf, it's normally because they just don't bloody know what to do. They're terribly scared things are going to blow up and they don't have the skills to fix it. So you become the leader. You step up, you lead the family through and start to find the way. So don't just sit there and complain like a victim. You're in the seat to be able to drive it forward. And I think
and be conscious that they might be afraid, the older generation.
They 9 times out of 10 are.
Yeah, work through who can you get to come in and help them understand why it's important. That might be an advisor, that might be their accountant, or it might be a family friend. You need to think about, if we've got entrenchment, approach this carefully and strategically. Who is the best person to help resolve that anxiety and make them feel more confident about it? Because and you and I have seen this so much over the last however many years, if parents don't have enough to retire on, for example, that's hurdle number one. And the earlier that's being planned for, people should be planning for this if they're planning to stay on farm in their 40s. Because the earlier you plan for what you might need away from the farm in retirement, the easier it is to get there. And that doesn't mean we can't at a later point. It just means it might be a little trickier. But if it's not dealt with at all, because farms are busy and it's easy to just day to day keep working in and on the business. But at the end of the day, you don't want your family to fall apart because this hasn't been worked through. So, someone needs to be the leader to say, how do we progress this forward? But also everyone else in the family needs to think, we need to support the leader. So we need to educate ourselves if we haven't already. We need to think about the things that we're concerned about and see if we should get advice on what we can do to protect against that concern, because there will usually be an option. It's just understanding what those options are that might be in the way of things moving forward.
I'd highly counsel, I see a lot of problems, Kylie, is around the daughter-in-law scenario where there's an innate fear in mum and dad that they'll get divorced and the daughter-in-law will get the farm and sell the farm and it's all gone. Now, what I see in families is, regardless of how good a relationship they've got with their daughter-in-law, that's a real fear for families. It might be only a small fear in the back of their head, but they do worry about it. So I'd counsel daughter-in-laws all the time to be able to go, look, just because mum and dad are worried about that doesn't mean they think any less of you. It's a fear. No. It doesn't mean I'm fearful of snakes, but I'm not expecting a snake to come into my office here and bite me. You can be fearful of it, but doesn't mean you believe it. And it's not a judgment about you. So let them explain that fear. And a lot of the times when that bubbles to the surface and they talk about it, mum and dad feel so much better. And daughter-in-law can go, okay, look, it's not a personal attack on me. I just need to let them get this out, move on and go again. And I've actually seen a big family have a dust up over this with a daughter-in-law they were very close. And in the end, they were stronger because they talked about these issues.
Important to work through. And that's a really good point. It doesn't mean that they don't like the daughter-in-law, for example, or the son-in-law, if that's the case. It just means that they know someone where it's happened, for example. So the reality is there and the fear is there. Now, in my view, if you don't discuss it, you've got a very high risk of creating what you're actually afraid of.
Yeah, what you fear you create.
Quite so. So it's important to think about that and work through it, because it isn't best for the business to not be progressing, particularly to the next generation, because of that type of fear. Because businesses don't evolve and grow if they're held back You need the next generation to, because they will have different ideas, different views, be more across the latest technological developments, all the sort of things that can help grow and progress the farm. You need to have them to be unfettered to do that. So working through those things is just so important. And then, as we're talking about, making sure when you are transitioning, documenting it, and we can cover those fears in the document, certainly to a point, because I strongly don't believe you should tie people up in knots forever. But certainly we can cater for some of those things in a properly drafted agreement.
Yeah, excellent. Well, look, Kylie, we're running out of time now. I could talk about this all day because it's very technical and we've only just scratched the surface on the opportunities. Before we head off, can you just give us one piece of advice around this topic that you give anyone listening to take away with them?
And it comes back to what I said before, that the thing I think holds everything up all the time. Be clear about what you want and then work towards getting that. But you can't work towards, there is no plan in any form of life if you don't know what you want. So if it's parents, for example, and you actually want the business to stay in the family and you want to be able to retire comfortably, then identify that and work out the plan to get there. And this is even before we're looking at the transition. So the earlier you've identified what you want and then what needs to happen to achieve that, the more likely the family is to communicate about these things and progress it.
Because the road to somewhere often leads to nowhere.
That's right.
Oh, that's perfect. Excellent. Kylie, where can people find you online?
Well, the Spark Helmore, because I'm at Spark Helmore website will have me. Fairly easy to track me down these days.
We'll put the details in the show notes, LinkedIn, all those places.
Yeah, but happy to have with these things in particular, I think people do get concerned or entrenched about. The main thing to remember about a family agreement is that the purpose of them is to help prevent dispute. They are a cheap insurance policy because litigation is always way more expensive. So documenting things properly when you transition helps prevent dispute, but also helps keep the family together, which is what we're trying to achieve here.
Yeah, without a doubt. That's very sage advice. Excellent, Kylie. Well, look, I always love having you on here. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy
Thanks for having
lady.
me, Ben. Yeah, great to chat.
And look forward to the next one.
All right. Thanks, Ben. Talk soon.
Well, guys, I love having people like Kylie on the podcast because I learn something every time. But I just want to summarize a few really important points I want to hammer home with you before you head off. Number one, you always are going to need outside help when it comes to this. You're never going to be able to do it on your own, and it's going to require multiple people involved. It might require a facilitator, like a meeting facilitator with the family. It might require professional advisors, so accountants and lawyers, etc. It might also require you to get some help with communication and building trust. It could be you might need some personal help from a psychologist or a family psychologist if you hit roadblocks and problems. So just remember, you're never going to achieve it on your own. Number two, fears. There are always going to be fears in family members, and you need to get really clear on what you fear and then find a way to discuss it as a family, because when a fear is brought out in the open, it helps people have that conversation. Now, it will be difficult, I'm sure, but if everyone goes in with a curious mindset and not taking anything personally, it's amazing how you can work through that and actually strengthen relationships. And the last one, which Kylie said, which I just want to hammer home, is work out what you absolutely bloody want. The amount of times I've had the younger generation come to me and say, oh, mum and dad won't tell me what they want. And I'll say to them, well, what do you want? And I'll get a blank stare. So work out what you want is really, really important. Now, for the older generation or the current generation, you need to think about retirement. What does retirement look like to you? Now, for some of you, that will be absolutely terrifying. But what I can tell you is you need to know what that is. Otherwise, you're going to end up causing grief for everyone involved. For some people, that means we just step back from the day-to-day operations, but we're still intimately involved in a mentoring or an employment capacity. For others, it means I'm out, I want to go traveling, I want to live in a unit on the beach, and that's okay as well. You just need to work out what the bloody hell do you want and then get very, very clear on that. And I'd suggest before you go down the analysis of succession planning is you work that out first. And then finally, start early. You heard me bang on about it. I'm going to tell you again. If you're 45 to 55, this is the ideal succession preparation area. It's when you should be preparing for your retirement. You should be preparing for how you're going to fund that retirement, so you're not becoming a liability on the business and putting it in a position where it can't survive. You don't want to put a noose around the next generation's neck. You also want to prepare the business. So scaling up, reducing debt, building off farm assets, increasing efficiency and productivity, expanding into new markets, diversifying, whatever that might be, and preparing the business to have a transition of leadership within the business. And then finally, you want to start preparing the next generation. So start early, start having these conversations. You've got to prepare them to be not only good farmers or graziers, you need to teach them how to become good members of the family, building those soft skills like communication, resilience, and how to build a strong, robust family, but also giving them the financial and business skills they need and the custodial management of wealth skills they need to be successful across the generations. So prepare yourself, prepare the business, and prepare the next generation is really, really important. Now, that's it for today. It's been a bloody good podcast. If you've enjoyed it, make sure you share it with your family and friends. We hit about 14,000 people downloaded last month, so I want you to share it with as many people as you can, because the more people that listen, the more impact we're going to have on families across the generations. Also, if you can jump onto Spotify or Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating and a comment, that'd be amazing as well. Now, that's it for this week. I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.